state just aren't stealing children, they're also stealing the elderly. I just had a harrowing conversation with a member of this audience who told me that social services have basically completely taken hostage her mother. They have forcibly medicated her, they've frozen her assets, they've frozen her bank account. So the state just aren't stealing children. They've claimed her mother has dementia, and now they've completely taken over her life. It's quite scary. Back to the EU. So today, unfortunately, is the day we pass over lawmaking powers to the EU in 43 areas. We have the wonderful Rodney Atkinson here. And let's give him a round of applause. Who is going to be talking about the British Declaration of Independence. I can't believe I just had another conversation with someone who said our constitution is dead. Please, by the end of today, let us realise that we do have one, and we have common law rights and rights as individuals, and we are all born free. Anyway, back to Rodney. He's going to cover the collapse of the EU and the evil origins of the EU. He is an expert on the constitutional effects of British membership of the EU and a former advisor to countless ministers. He's one of Britain's leading political economists, and he's got a really good track record of successfully predicting many things, which I'm sure he will go into. He's the author of countless books, which are sold just outside, and I hope you enjoy his talk. Round of applause, please.
I thought I was going to be all right there, then the lights suddenly altered. So, right, I'm sure very few people in this room, but I'm afraid a lot of people in our society in general still think they live in a country called the United Kingdom, with a parliament which makes our laws, a democracy which allows us to elect our lawmakers. We live in a capitalist society, that we enjoy habeas corpus, prima facie evidence of any maldoing before we are arrested and trial by a jury. We assume all these things, but we don't, because we know we haven't got them. In fact, we do not have a country. The country that governs us is called Europe. Indeed, in one of the great buildings of the new superstate, it says, Europe, your country. As we know, we have no borders. We don't even have our own international fishing grounds anymore. 80% of laws are made outside our parliament. We don't live in a capitalist, free enterprise society. We live in a corporatist society, where not just big business, supranational corporations have the power and the money to buy legislation on their behalf and against our interests, but as we saw from Brian's excellent contribution this morning, it's also even more evil in the social realm, to do with our children and our families. We can no longer rely on being detained fairly. We can be arbitrarily arrested under the European arrest warrant, where we can be extradited to other countries that do not enjoy our traditional centuries-old freedoms under the law. And don't forget, our freedoms under the law stem from 1215, Magna Carta. 800 years we've enjoyed those freedoms, long before we had so-called democracy. Because democracy, you see, doesn't consist of being allowed to elect to our parliament every 5 years people who we don't know, who we never see, who we don't understand, who don't understand us, and who are there to make a killing in expenses and pension rights. No, that, I'm sure, none of us would regard as democracy. But that's what the BBC calls democracy. And there's a parade, a pretense every 5 years, that that's what we've got.
I'm just all about law, not politics. There was a certain amount of law in the previous presentation. Rodney woke me up. I read one of his books 15 years ago, and I thank him for it. I'll do it in person when I get the opportunity. What I will say to him is in actual fact, the European Union Treaty is invalid because it was obtained by fraud. Mr. Heath was a traitor. There's a legal opinion to the effect that there's a convention on treaties. If one party is acting fraudulently, the whole thing's void, and it goes away. You notice I'm wearing a poppy. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and create a vision of a new society formed on the basis of lawful self-defence. It's something we had within living memory, and it's been taken away from us. And it's been done by stealth. And the object of the exercise is to tell you what happened to the right to bear arms, how it can be recovered. And the reason for doing that is, the only constraint on government is trial by battle, trial by combat. And that's reflected in the textbooks. I'll be quoting a textbook by an expert on the Constitution by the name of Professor Dicey, and he said in certain circumstances it would be right to rise up. It would be right to rise up. And he puts forward a proposition that politicians have a problem with that because they don't know how far to push the envelope. It's an inexact science. It's an inexact science. So if the population have got the right to rise up, they need to know about it, and the politicians need to take it on board. And there could be circumstances where just the threat of an insurrection should be sufficient to cause the politicians to draw back. And you could argue that's where we are now. 83%, was it 93% don't want to be in the EU? I'm going to be assisted in this talk by my long-term friend, I've known him for 30 years, Richard Law, who's a knowledge expert on firearms law. I've known him for 30 years. He didn't speak to me for the first 10 because I was a policeman. He didn't trust a policeman. But we got over it. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end because it's a new field for many people and they don't know much about it. The right to lawful rebellion. Which button do I press to go? Is it page? That one? I'm going to talk about authorities. First, I'm going to talk about the rights of Englishmen. The last is the right to bear arms, so that's what we're coming up to. We're going to talk about the rights of Englishmen, and the sources of these authorities are law books. Law books record history, and the further you go back in time, the closer law books and history books come together. Because some of the sources that we go back to, there weren't any law books, that were just history books. So we've got the next picture. Bit of a hero of mine, William Blackstone, a jurist writing in the 1750s, codified the common law, big supporter of the common law, and his textbooks are authoritative. In other words, the courts refer to them. If you say Blackstone, the courts know what it means. So the rights of Englishmen, here we go. And English women and Scotsmen and Scotswomen, obviously. In these several articles consist the rights, or as they're frequently termed, the liberties of Englishmen. Liberties is more generally talked of than thoroughly understood, and yet highly necessary to be perfectly known and considered by every man of rank or property. So that's what we're doing. We're sharing this information. Lest his ignorance of the points whereupon they are founded should hurry him into faction and licentiousness on the one hand, or a pusillanimous indifference and criminal submission on the other. So that's Blackstone saying if you don't know about it, you can't claim it, and it'll be taken away. Now, I'm conscious of the time, so what I'm going to do is go quite quickly through these slides. If you want to read them in detail, they will be on the video. You can pause the video and read them. Some people just look at the speaker, so they take in what he's saying and don't get distracted by the slides, so you've got a choice.
The right to keep and bear arms, as John says, is still there. It's hiding in plain sight. Now, I went looking for the source, the root, and in doing that there's a whole series of stepping stones which I've got a feeling you already know, so I don't need to spend much time on them. If one was a conveyancing solicitor looking for the authority that the seller has for property, then one goes back through the deeds looking for a good solid root. When we do that with the right to keep and bear arms, it takes us straight back to Alfred the Great and his Domes book. Now, Alfred didn't invent a right to keep and bear arms. What he enshrined was an obligation. The obligation of the individual citizens, the men, was to be prepared to defend the realm in time of crisis. Now, defending the realm in those days meant going toe-to-toe with Vikings, Irishmen, Frenchmen, whoever turned up. And no one is going to go up against any of those invading forces without being properly prepared, without being armed, and without having trained in the use of those arms. So I'm grateful to the Americans for kind of spotting the obligations to be trained, though they tend to ignore it because they focus on the later word, the right. So moving on from Alfred the Great, we know that the Norman invasion meant that William took on, as it were, the baggage of our constitution as well as the crown. And Alfred, I think the basis of his legislation was Mosaic law cobbled together with some Saxon statutes. And the Saxon law seems more concerned with property, and the Mosaic law seems more concerned with people. So the principle, as I see it, was Leviticus 19, which says, "Do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to your or favouritism to the great, but judge your neighbour fairly." Now, the idea of it's not fair is understood by every 4-year-old, so it's not difficult. Now, moving forwards, I think the next milestone I came to was, I'll skip Magna Carta, just very briefly. John gave a very good explanation of it. He tried to repeal it the following year, and it was Edward I who brought in a statute in 1297 reaffirming Magna Carta. And I noticed that he did that just 1 month after an English army lost a battle at Stirling Bridge to William Wallace. And I bet William Wallace's lawyers had to have a good look at that. Now, it said that there were ordinary statutes and there were constitutional ones, and an ordinary one could not impliedly repeal the Constitution. If it was repealing a constitutional act, it had to say so on its face. None of the Firearms Act say anything about repealing the Bill of Rights, so they don't have any impact on it. So taken together, Mike Burke's case and Metric Martyr's case are clear that the Bill of Rights still exists. I put this into a book in 2011, Does the Trigger Pull the Finger? No one's objected. No one's come back and said I was wrong. In 2014, we challenged the Scottish Government on the subject of is there implied repeal in Scotland, and they came back and said exactly what my book says. So either they've read my book or there is no implied repeal and your right to keep and bear arms is still absolute.
Two more minutes. I'll ask my wife to stand up. Okay? Yeah. And what have you got? Your spray? Right. She's got a self-defence spray, a red dye spray, and she's got full authority for her to carry it in her left hand. Can you see it at the back? It's a British passport. It's a British passport. Okay? Thank you, Tina. Sit down. Okay? Trust me on this. The Home Office put up a document called Firearms Law Guidance to the Police, and when I was a policeman at one point I was issuing firearms certificates, or doing the paperwork for issuing firearms certificates. It was reissued last year, and here's what it says on this topic. You see that? Firearms for personal protection, applications for the grant of a firearms certificate for the applicants for another protection, or that of premises, should be refused on the grounds that firearms are not an acceptable means of protection in Great Britain. Who said so? Yeah. How many think that firearms aren't an acceptable means? Put your hands up. Who wants to be armed?
I am.
It's more or less every, well, it's about half, isn't it? Yeah, okay, to be fair, it's about half, isn't it? Yeah. This is a politician talking, and the politician talking was Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, 1969.
Thank you for being here today, and the last time I was at the British Constitution Group meeting was 3 years ago, and how much has changed during our personal journey and on the national journey, on the world's journey on all these things. Back 3 years ago, I was looking at things because I could see the